Hi, I'm Nina Bosky, and welcome to LifeBites, where each and every week we'll get you inspired in the areas of life, business, and media. We'll help you dare, dream, do, and be so you can get out of your head into your soul in order to tune in and take a bite. This week, we are getting you business inspired. Hi, everybody. My name is Nina Bosky, and welcome to LifeBites Business Inspired. Our guest in Business Inspired is a person who has been in this industry for 40 plus years. He's one of the pioneers in the level of personal and organizational transformation. He has led leaders in those trenches, but has led leaders through uncertain times, which is happening right now. And not only looking at how we can really develop ourselves in true grit during a time of uncertainty, but he gives us the ability to look at things differently and see what's possible, even the choices that we're going to consider. So with that said, I'd like to welcome Jim Selman to the show. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Nina. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. I'm so excited to have you on the show today because, being in the world of transformation myself, I see it up close and personal, which is people are in a lot of fear right now. And so where I'd like to direct this conversation, because you have such a vast body of work, it's like, where do we start, right? And so I thought I would start in the level of uncertainty first, and then we'll get to the unlearning leadership, which I think is a really interesting concept as well. So, have you ever seen anything like this time before?
No. I think there have always been times of uncertainty, but the numbers of things that were simultaneously uncertain, plus what was at stake and the time frame in which to adjust or adapt or assimilate change was vastly slower. I think what's really differentiating today's changing environment is the speed with which things are changing, and also the depth and breadth of some of the implications from some of the kinds of changes. So, for example, the world of biochemistry is now opening up the possibilities of cloning people, and the world of transportation. Some of the current pundits are predicting, and I think rightly so, that the notion of having a personal automobile may be disappearing, and that all of these things are happening with incredibly shortened time frames. Within a decade or so, most of us could not even begin to predict what it's going to look like in almost any industry and almost any field.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing up such a big point, not to mention the technology with AI and everything that's coming down the pike with that. I mean, we're in charted waters, and I never thought about it from the perspective of speed, really, but you're right. We're just catching up with one element and adjusting to that, and it's almost like a wave comes in and says, no, you got to adjust to this too, and you got to keep on innovating and being able to, chart uncharted waters. So how do you work with leaders to help them during this time? Because it is, I'm seeing it. It's like we want to feel like we have the answers, but we don't really have the answers. And we're trying to figure it out just as much as their employees and everybody else is trying to figure it out. So how do you help leaders through this phase of uncharted waters?
Well, I think as a general statement, I don't try to convince them that it's all going to turn out. I don't try to give them good rationales for trying to be better at predicting. I basically say this is the fact of life: is we're living in a continuously disruptive world, and that it's affecting. You could say it's a big paradigm change if you want to use that language, but most of the leaders I speak to are aware of that. You don't have to convince them that the world is upside down and that things are changing dramatically, and that most of our conventional wisdom can no longer be relied upon. As you're familiar from my book, Living in a Real-Time World, my thesis, and the reason I use the term real-time world, is that the gap, just as in computers, the gap between inputs and outputs got shorter and shorter until one day we declared there's real-time computing, and computers shifted from informing to performing. I believe that what we're witnessing today is that the gap between the future and the past is getting shorter and shorter as a consequence of the accelerating change, such that most of our conventional foundations for decision making, for living, for rationale, is falling apart. The notion of control, the notion of prediction. Our entire budgeting and planning world is built on predicting what's going to happen. And if you give up that belief, you then have to say, what am I going to do to navigate and to move successfully in a world where I don't have control and I don't have predictions, or I can't rely on my predictions? And my answer, the subtitle of the book was 6 capabilities to succeed in an unpredictable world. This was written before the pandemic.
How apropos right now, right?
The metaphor that I'm using, and it speaks to your question, Nina, is the Starship Enterprise. If you can adapt that metaphor to your life or to your company, that we're navigating where we've never gone before. And now this may vary somewhat by industry and so forth, but for the most part, most of us are having to make choices that are going to affect the rest of our lives or our future of our company. And we have to have the capacity to commit to possibilities before we have evidence that it's possible.
Wow. So true. It's, it is so much what you're saying. And, I think you're making such an excellent point. And I remember hearing a statistic back in the mid 2000s that the ex CEO of Google said that we are processing in a 48-hour period as much information as we did from the dawn of civilization to 2003. Now
Wow.
that was 20 years ago. Okay.
That works for me, but I hadn't heard that one. But that's exactly whatever the variables are. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you think about that processing of information, and now it's intensified with social media and video, and the world is really a lot closer. I mean, it's not like when you and I were growing up, Russia felt so far away, and the crisis in Russia, it was like this big kind of unknown over there. Now everything is right here, literally right here in our faces. With technology, with the world changing so quickly, I don't know if our brains can handle it, like from the standpoint of, what's happening. How do you combat that to, not just leaders, but people in business? Because I see people imploding left and right. They can't handle all the
Well,
stress.
to follow your example, it occurs to you one day that I can't do it. It's not possible for me to process all the information and everything that's going on. So you develop one of those skills I mentioned is you need to change your notion of how you learn. And you begin to, for example, see that having a team or having people in your world that are curating information in areas that are important to you are trusted people. We're dealing with all this stuff about fake news, for example, and what information do you believe and what information do you not? The information is no longer the question. The question is, who do you trust to curate your news? And if you don't have any,
that's a huge one, because I would just say overall the media, they just want the next big story versus fact checking and all that stuff that goes along with it, right?
But that's true. That's true. And again, depending upon not only which sources of information do you curate, but also for the sake of what are you doing the curation? If you're just feeding your curiosity, that's one thing. If you're making big bets in your life or your company, that's something else.
Yeah.
And again, if you think you have to do all that by yourself, you're probably suffering quite a bit. So that you have to begin to open up the possibility of team learning. So everybody on the team gathers some of the information, and then you bring it together in a dialogue, and you get enough clarity around what you need to know to then be able to make a decision one way or the other. But that the idea of the individual Renaissance man or woman that's somehow going to be able to assimilate all of this stuff and come up with these brilliant, actions is falling apart, which is also affecting our whole reality in terms of political leadership. People, when they're afraid and when they're anxious and when they're lost and when they're struggling, begin to look for the Superman or woman who's going to be able to arise as the leader that will somehow save us or guide the way. And in most cases, that leads to some form of authoritarian, populist kind of leader, rather than necessarily the person who's the best team player, or
Oh,
the person who has the biggest network, or the person that
who has got the largest financial contributions. I mean, it becomes a much bigger, especially in the political realm. But you're bringing up a good point, because you don't have to be in politics to have this same thing happen, where you're looking to the outside world for your answer, and those
well, that's
answers.
right. And I mean, at the end of the day, I think more and more it's becoming obvious that the strength and necessary condition for success is going to be relationships.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, the only thing that you can count on over time are not the only thing, but the primary thing is our relationships.
yeah.
And and if you have those relationships, and you honor and cultivate those relationships, and you respect those relationships, they will typically be a community that you can trust, and that you can be yourself, and you can contribute, and you can be contributed to within that environment.
Very much so. So you've been at this for a while. You were, one of the pioneers in this industry, really. And I think that you've seen a lot of trends come and go. And now we're in a different phase with the acceleration process that you're talking about. How can we, if a leader is listening to this right now and saying, man, I am really scared, I'm very fearful right now. My company might be going through layoffs. I don't even know. I don't know what the future is going to bring. And I know we need to innovate, or we're going to be obsolete in a few years. What would be one of the first things that you would say to that leader or business that needs to start doing things differently but doesn't know how?
Well, let's assume that I have more than a couple of minutes or a soundbite to respond.
Yeah, I know it's a
But
big question.
I would say it's some variation of, you need to develop the skills in several different domains. One of the domains I call is existential confidence. That's learning to trust yourself even if you're afraid.
Mhm.
If you're going to give a speech to a big audience, it's normal to be afraid. But if you let the fear justify not going in front of the group, then you've killed that possibility. So you learn to take your fear with you, and learn to trust yourself as one of the three foundations of transformational leadership.
Yeah.
A second foundation has to do with what I call emotional resilience. And this is the ability to distinguish and recognize that the primary characteristic of human beings are emotions and mood. And that you might think of mood as the manifestation of your way of being, or who you are. And we've all had lots of experience with moods. The third foundation is what I call self-reinvention. And that is, if you acknowledge and accept the premise that the world is changing faster and faster, it's critical to develop a skill set of reinventing yourself in order to stay current and relevant in the world as it's emerging. If you don't have that, you're almost certainly going to be anxious, fearful, and pretty much
Yeah.
out of touch, left behind.
That makes a lot of sense. And, I think also is, if you are fearful, with going back to your group of team members, that you have people on your team that you can collaborate with, that you can have these conversations with. How do you approach having more breakthrough conversations? How would you look at doing something like that with the leaders that you are, not just yourself leading, but just anybody that be either watching or listening to this?
Well, I think breakthroughs have everything to do with what's possible and what we're committed to. If you could prove a possibility, it wouldn't be a possibility; it would be an example. So it's important that we be willing to commit to bigger possibilities before there's any evidence that they can be accomplished. That doesn't mean to be foolish or make fanciful kinds of commitments, but it means that You need to stand in the current reality as you know it, as you experience it, and say, I have two futures. I can have the future that's possible, or I can have the future that's predictable.
Ooh.
No, never
Well,
mind how.
and given what you're saying about the fact that the Star Trek example, right? You almost have to approach it from a world of possibility. And so many people, when they get scared, they like to focus on the problem. And then they
Exactly.
expand that problem instead of looking at the possibility, right? So I think that's
Absolutely.
really,
Absolutely correct.
yeah, and to come up with those different solutions. So let's shift a little bit and let's talk about, I love this article that you wrote about unlearning leadership, and you had some principles around this. And I think this is really interesting because given what we're talking about, for some people, teaching a dog new tricks is not always such an easy thing, but you got to unlearn some things in order to be able to look at the possibility, if it's possible or not. So let's talk about, how did you come up with this idea of unlearning leadership?
As you asked the question, I'm not sure where the idea originated from. I think maybe what I was thinking at the time, there's a Peter Drucker quote I like, which is that we know absolutely almost nothing about leadership, which is why we write so many books about it. I've for a long time preached against the value of lots of techniques and so forth. But when I say unlearning leadership, it really resonates with what I mean by reinventing yourself. It's a recognizing that most, if not, or much, if not most of your behavior, your actions, your way of being, your style is habitual. And as a consequence, it may be a successful habit or it may be an unsuccessful habit. But as anyone who's ever pushed the envelope of their own competence realizes, if you keep applying those old habits to new situations, it pretty much doesn't work for very long.
Yes, like
That
what is it? Albert Einstein insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, right? We've got to be able to do something new. So how would somebody say if they were listening to this and going, "Oh my gosh, I do a level of management or leadership this way, and it's not working." Particularly if you have a multi-generational, multiracial, multicultural, team, you have to really be agile and flexible, etc. How do you start to approach that and start to unlearn these things?
Well, again, the first part of all of these questions is really to test and challenge your observations.
Mm,
That you are the observer,
I
and whether
like
we're
that.
talking about
I'm writing this
whether
down. This is good. Observe.
whether we're talking about new habits or reinventing yourself or traveling in an unpredictable, uncertain world, you are the observer, and you're the primary navigator. So
Okay.
if you can acknowledge that, you can begin to see yourself somewhat objectively. I
And you know what too, Jim? Do you see this? This I see happens a lot. There's a lot of executive decisions and they don't necessarily they don't observe, they think in their think tank, and then they execute throughout the rest of the company without asking the key people not only what they think, but does this work? You know what I mean? Because it
You're
might
exactly
work
right.
great in a concept, but you go to apply it and it's like, either it's met with resistance or two, it's not really applicable to the day to day.
Absolutely, that's correct. And again, the problem here is that most people are not organized around their commitments.
Oh yeah.
They're organized around what they think. What you say. You're assuming that your thoughts are connected to the world, and that if your thought is yours, that if you tell people to do something, that they will do it.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
live in this kind of uh, I don't know, interpretation of the world that's just no longer applicable. You
Yeah,
know,
but our own interpretation is our world, but somebody like if I'm talking to you, assuming that you have my interpretation, you and I might have very different viewpoints, but I'm just now telling you this is what I'd like to do, etc., or this is how I feel about something. And I like that, being the observer and watching for a while and not assuming.
that's right. And I also believe it's important to recognize that almost everything we're doing in conversations with other human beings. and sometimes conversations with ourselves. But there's a set of work I do called conversational competency,
Oh,
in which we begin to recognize, and this was discovered in the 40s, I think, by some linguist, that all verbs in human language are not the same. That some of the verbs describe action and some of the verbs are action. And so when I say I promise you, I'm making a commitment in language. I'm not referring to something else. My promise exists in my speaking it to you.
wow.
So the more conscious people become of their conversations, and that includes how we listen to each other, the more present we can be to the conversations and the consequences of those conversations. So whether we sit around and have a bull session about whether something can happen or not, or whether we sit around and have a committed conversation for possibility or accomplishing something, it makes all the difference in the world. One is a bull session sitting in the stands, the other is a play on the field.
Oh,
And
that's so true.
and one moves the ball and the other explains why the ball didn't move. So it's important to appreciate that as human beings, the main gift we have, and perhaps the singular most important gift as individuals that we have, is our capacity to commit. I believe that only the individual can make a commitment. We cannot commit. You can commit, I can commit, we can align our commitment. But the source of commitment is always the individual. And
That's a very good point.
if it's authentic, it can change the world.
Yeah. That's the key, right? And I think that's the interesting thing about what you're saying about commitment. And I don't know about you, but I see this happen a lot. And I don't know if it's because of our culture as of late, people are tired, they're on Zoom calls all day, it's this level of kind of fatigue, kind of like world fatigue. I'm not even going to say United States fatigue, but
Yep.
I had somebody say to me, I'll get you this tomorrow. Tomorrow came and went, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, that commitment was just fluff words. But I see that happen a lot, particularly like if I'm not in the office. We're in a hybrid remote environment. A lot of us were working differently, etc. That conversation, that commitment is the glue that keeps the company flowing. Is there, I mean, that,
And about the third time you do that, I'm going to stop taking your commitment seriously.
yeah, exactly. Then it moves to trust, right? Now I don't
Well,
trust you.
yeah, you have no, I cannot trust a person who does not honor their word.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean you have to keep all your commitments, but if you're not going to keep them, you tell me beforehand that you're not going to keep that commitment for whatever reason.
Exactly. And that I see that happen quite a bit in companies. And there's a lot of it started as a leeway when everybody had to be home and there was a challenge. So everybody had to make accommodations. But there's something I'm seeing that's kind of still lingering here. It's like, well, wait a minute here. We're back to work. We're not at the beginning of this pandemic. We're at the end of this pandemic. So why are we still allowing some of this stuff in terms of accountability or commitments and that communication? So back to this unlearning leadership here. You talked a little bit about observer. That's one of the things that you have to do. What would be the second step that somebody would have to do?
I think you need to be able to make very acute assessments. So one of the things I teach is that most of our coordination and most of our relationship to the world is a product of all of our judgments and assessments about the way things are. Unfortunately, we don't get rigorous about that kind of thinking oftentimes, and therefore we confuse our opinions about the world with our commitments in the world. So if you have judgments about the way something is, and you take the time to reflect, is that really something you're committed to, or is that just common hearsay or common sus? You begin to get very present to things like gossip, can kill an organization. You become very sensitive to what it means when you say walk the talk. It begins to sensitize us to cultivating integrity in our conversations and in our relationship to whatever subjects we care about. Now, leadership is a topic that's filled with a lot of myth and conventional wisdom. That you need authority for leadership, for example. Is that true? No, it's not true at all. Many times the leader is not even have a role or a position of authority. Gandhi had no authority,
But he was
and
a
yet
leader.
he changed history. And you could all go down the list of people that we admire as leaders, and almost in every case, their authority was not a big factor. It doesn't mean you
Wow.
can't have authority, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. That's very true. That's very true. Look at how effective Gandhi was. So that's two. Was there a third step in here that somebody would have to learn to unlearn?
But you'd have to say that that's one of the beliefs that we walk around with. So unlearning leadership is like challenging your assumptions and beliefs about leadership, because
Yeah.
for all of us will find ourselves, I can't be a leader because.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've had that happen a lot. I teach and work with a lot of new managers, right? And new managers they have doubt in themselves because they've never done it before. And so they think, oh, if they've seen a leader be effective, oh, I'm not that person. But I always say it's not about being that person, it's about being authentically you and bringing those qualities out to help inspire and create a vision for people. And that will allow people to want to respond to that and collaborate with you, et cetera. And I think the leadership of today is different than when you and I started, right? When you and I started, I don't know about you, but it was do as I say, not as I do.
That's exactly right. And I mean, there are thousands, if not more, models or books on the subject of leadership. I one time went to Amazon, and I think there were 11,000 books or something like that on the subject of leadership. And if you imagine you could read all of those and assimilate everything in all of those books, it still would not make you a leader.
Isn't that the truth? It gives you concepts.
Yeah,
What do you think?
make you a scholar maybe, but not a leader.
Well, I mean, there's nothing that is applied to getting rolling up your sleeves. And I remember during the pandemic, I was part of an organization that I replaced the ex-president. So I was leading about 35 people in this networking group, and everything was great until it wasn't. And I had to move everybody into Zoom, and they're used to being in person, right? And the resistance that I had, I was like, okay, there's no time like the present. Let's roll up our sleeves and jump in. And it gave me, actually, that experience gave me a lot and really allowed me to create what I would call not just grit, but grace. I had to have some grit there, very, very nice person usually the time, but I had to hold my own and yet at the same time be graceful about it. And it's always a little bit of a balancing act.
And this gets to the third part of your question, I think, because you could turn that into a tip you just said. Say grace is a quality of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And in your case, it was true. On the other hand, one could easily imagine let's say, a harsher, gruffier, less sophisticated uh, person in the same kind of position you were in the same kind of situation that also could be effective.
Exactly. Exactly.
So
It's not one size fits all, right?
that's right. And I think you might begin to see that who you are is really what produced a result, not the technique that you were using or the technique that you had.
Yeah.
It's if you think that the world is increasingly networked, and that coordination and planning and action is increasingly a network phenomenon, then the notion of collaboration becomes a collaboration of anyone who could be a potential leader at any time. That leadership is not a role. It may be that in that situation you were a leader, and in another situation with different commitment, different vision, different
Yeah.
breakdown, so forth, somebody else might rise to that role.
And I also think that for any of us to be in those different roles is actually a good place to be, kind of exercises different muscles as well. And you learn different skill sets, to potentially even support somebody else's vision and allowing them to lead the way. What do you think are the qualities that make a good leader?
Well, the number one quality, I think, is integrity. And by that, I mean someone who is willing to acknowledge that I am my word, that I say what I mean and I mean what I say, and I'm not operating out of having to be right. So
Okay, wait. We can talk about this one. This is a good one because I know several leaders that think that they are leading their teams in a good direction. And they may 95% of it until they hit that speed bump or that wall, which is, I'm right. Okay. Now I have my own feelings about where that comes from, but what would you say to the leader that genuinely thinks they're right? And
well,
dealing with a team or a company, because that need to be right sometimes overshadows what needs to be right, if that makes
well,
sense.
I would say something like this. I would say only the individual makes a commitment, whether they're right or wrong. But no
Okay.
individual can fulfill a commitment without other people.
Ooh, say that one again,
So,
'cause that one's good.
I believe that only the individual can make a commitment, but no human being can fulfill those commitments without other people. Now, that means if you think you're right, you better have a team that's aligned with you, or you're just a jerk that's, proffering your point of view.
Yeah, and but that happens quite a bit, and that technical right, you still have to collaborate with other people, and if you still may not get to what you want to fulfill, which is a great product, a great service, a great team, whatever that is. So I think that's important.
I also think it's very important to appreciate the difference between I'm right, like an ego position, like I, Jim Selman, am right about this, and by God, anybody else is wrong, is not the kind of thing that you have when you have a conviction and you have a vision and you're 100% committed to that vision because you trust and believe that vision.
Yes.
That's what I meant by being committed to a possibility before there's evidence that it's possible. But the idea here is that that can give you enormous power, whether you have authority or not. But
Well,
it's not at the cost of other people.
it speaks to Gandhi too, what you said about not necessarily being authoritative, but he had a vision and a passion and a purpose. And so that wasn't about, I'm going to now lead the people down this road. It was more like, I have a vision and this is what I'm standing for. I'm making a stand on something. And I like that distinction between ego, I'm right, and I am making a stand for my passion and purpose of what I believe in. I think those are very distinct qualities. So we
That's
have,
right. Now, you asked that earlier question about the qualities of leadership. The
yeah.
second and third qualities I point to is one is relationship. So we had integrity, we have relationship, and then I think the last quality I would say is something we might call passion or enthusiasm or a mood of ambition.
Oh, and you have a book out there too. It's called Ambition in the Real World. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the title is actually serene ambition.
Oh, Serene Ambition. Okay. All right.
I've been using that term for most of my career, and I use serenity because it kind of captures the Eastern philosophy or the state of their worldview in the Eastern traditions, whereas ambition is pretty characteristic of most Western enterprise, and that the two don't necessarily go together normally.
No, they
Uh,
don't.
and yet you could say that the Eastern world, at least historically, not so much anymore, but traditionally, when I was using the term, you could say is materially challenged, in terms of their infrastructure and their material world. And we in the West have a rich material world, but we're spiritually bankrupt in many cases.
Yes.
So if you were going to combine the power of the East and the power of the West, where you could actually have peace, confidence, serenity, trust, at the same time that you could be committed to possibility and creating a bigger and better world. If you could put those two together, you sort of have my notion of serene ambition. And when you don't have a way of controlling or predicting where you're going, I think you need that as the prevailing mood, because it is at the end of the day a mood. It's a mood of, anything is possible, and yet at the same time, the way it is perfect.
Well, and accepting what is without having to control or try to predict the future, but staying in that possibility. You got to really, that is an inward job a lot of times, to not manifest those anxieties and fears and react to things. Because I also see a lot of companies, they react instead of really taking it. I always say, I love this quote I always use is, in order to speed up, sometimes you have to slow down. And then that slow down,
That's right.
you get to really kind of view what is my next step, and getting out of that kind of reactionary space.
Same exact principle is what I used as a foundation in teaching coaching. For a coach, there's always two of you. There's who you are as a history and who you are as a possibility. And as a history, as a history of a story, up to now, you're absolutely perfect the way you are, for the simple reason that's the way you are. But simultaneously, you're also a much larger possibility. Always, at any moment in life, you're always a bigger possibility. So therefore, if I'm a coach, I'm acknowledging the former, and I'm committed to the latter. So no matter how much you accomplish, I'll always see you as a bigger possibility.
I love
And
that.
I'll always accept and honor whatever you've accomplished so far.
Oh, I like
My
that.
job,
That's a
my
beautiful way of
job is
saying it.
Yeah, my job is not to fix you. My job is to point to and allow you to see yourself in a bigger frame than you've normally allowed yourself to see yourself.
I love this conversation. This is powerful. And I think that, so much of people, when they get tired, they get fatigued, they get stressed, they get fearful, they lose that sense of possibility. And I think this is a great reminder for people to tap back into that, because we don't always have to be who we were yesterday. We have that possibility to be somebody different, but we have to believe that we have that possibility as well, right? So, a question I have for you in relation to people. What do you say to the employee that says, why do I have to have all this stuff and look at possibility and communicate? I just want to get in my job, get in and get out. Okay. What would you say to that person that looks at the mechanics of the job and says, as long as I show up, I bring in my 8 hours, I do my thing, nobody should complain, I don't have to do all this other stuff, and I'm just going to be out? What would you say to that person?
I'd say that that's a choice that you have to make, and I honor and respect it if that's what you've chosen. But but I would ask, are you fulfilled? And if you're not, then I'd say there's a possibility you might want to explore.
That's a good one. I think that's really important, because there's a lot of people out there that are feeling quite stuck at the moment too. And so they also, they might have looked at, as long as I'm doing my job, why do I need to plug into the employee's well-being? Why do I have to do this? Why is all this stuff necessary? And I am thinking, for the very reason why you talked about serene ambition, we used to be able to have them separated, where you had the mechanics and, let's say, the material world. I'm going to get this out there no matter what. I'm going to leave my emotions and my personal life at home, and I'm not going to bring the two together. We now know, and we knew a long time ago, that that wasn't the case. We bring all of us to work, whether we think so or not, right? So this other aspect of it, the serene, the ability to, create that emotional resilience of what you talked about, whether you're a leader in a company or not, I believe this, you are a leader of your own life. So, these skill sets that you're talking about, you can apply them to your own life. Be the observer for a while, look at your sense of integrity. What are you committing to? All these things that you've shared with us today, I think each of us have to take a look at ourselves and ask ourselves some questions, particularly if we want to move into that world of possibility. Because I love your work, Jim. I really do. I think it's very profound, particularly right now, even though you wrote some of this stuff years ago.
Well, I share that conviction with you, and I think that at the end of the day, who knows what's going to happen. By the same token, you have a choice in how you're going to relate to that.
Is what inspires you.
Basically, people and the possibility that the world is. I mean, I try to live my life every day in the context of some possibility or another, and between possibility and people, it pretty well covers the range.
I would say you embody that quite a bit.
Well, thank you. My life bite really starts with a comment about I spent most of my career asking the question, "Who am I?"
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a long time to come to the pretty obvious conclusion that at the end of the day, there is no right answer. And that the one thing I learned in this process is that I am not a thing. And the answer that I've now committed to and that I live pretty much all the time now is that who I am is literally my relationships, my relationship with myself, my relationship with you and other people, my relationship with circumstances, my relationship with time, and my relationship to whatever's beyond my understanding.
Wow.
And those 5 relationships define who I am from my point of view. And I can't imagine existing in the absence of one of those relationships. On the other hand, I've now found even a deeper insight, which is that while I don't have control over much of my life, I always have a choice about how I relate to what's occurring. Always.
Always.
And if I can begin to see that the freedom and power to navigate, to fulfill my ambition, to serve and be of use to other people is never in the issue. It's always in my relationship to the issue. It's not just my commitment, but my relationship to my commitment.
I love how you frame that up, because you said it in a way that people can get that.
Good.
That really, we are our relationships, and who I am is in relation to, in this case, you were talking these 5 different areas. And I think that's an important one for anybody who's either listening or watching this right now, to take a look at those 5 areas of your life and look at your relationships as it relates to yourself. And how do you feel about yourself in I am? I think that's a beautiful way to look at life and look at yourself as well. Because I think a lot of people have a vision of themselves, but they're not quite living that and relating to that each and every day yet. So I think this is a great exercise for all of us to do. So thank you, Jim Selman. How can they reach you?
You can reach me at jimselman.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much today for spending some time with us, talking about the world, talking about leadership, and talking about unlearning leadership. And thank you for your words of wisdom. Great, great guest to have on the show today.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. I'm Nina Bosky for LifeBites Business Inspired. Until next time, remember, take a bite out of life before life takes a bite.